Gears Tactics is an interesting game, and I mean that not in terms of what it brings to the turn-based strategy genre, its story, or even, crucially, its gameplay. I mean that its existence represents some interesting developments for the game's publisher. Last console generation, when Microsoft was on top, publishing a game like Gears Tactics simply would not have interested them. A temporary PC-exclusive spin-off of one of their biggest franchises in a very niche genre and released on a cheap subscription service is not the sort of game that an on-top Microsoft would make. So its release represents a change for Microsoft. A change not only of their fortunes, having roundly lost the last console war, but a change in how they aim to carve out a bigger share of the market for themselves going forwards. In short, video game-wise, Microsoft want to be a services company first and foremost. They'll still sell you a box, sure, but it won't be the only place they intend to deliver games to you. You might say that in response to Microsoft selling fewer Xboxes than Sony sold PlayStations, Microsoft has said, let's stop console sales metrics being the important factor here. This may prove to be a very wise move indeed, as it roundly dispenses with the notion that the only way a platform holder can sell to you is on their platform. All of that is interesting and exciting to think about. Unfortunately, for me at least, it is rather more interesting and exciting than the actual game that Gears Tactics is. It is a turn-based, squad-based strategy game, very much in the style of the recent XCOM revival series from Firaxis. Given the game's similarity to that, it encourages constant comparisons between the two, and unfortunately, the result of such comparisons is not always favourable. As far as I'm concerned, Gears takes several steps back from XCOM and about one major step forward. It also underscores an opinion that I've long held about XCOM and this style of turn-based strategy game more generally, which is that the metagame is all important. By metagame, I mean the gameplay elements of the turn-based strategy game that do not take place with boots-on-the-ground soldiers shooting guns at each other in a turn-based manner. In XCOM, this involves building out a base, researching technology, upgrading and customizing your troops, and managing your resources. It's a fun, surprisingly deep series of carrots on sticks that keeps you excited for the next thing and helps heighten the stakes of the action in combat. The combat alone is fun and challenging, but the metagame layer is what keeps you coming back. Unlike some recent XCOM derivatives, Gears is wise enough to keep the metagame layer in place. Unfortunately, this is rather thin comparatively, and consists only of customizing your soldiers' gear and choosing unlockable talents for them. The extent to which this diminished metagame layer matters is reduced further due to the game being a Gears game. What I mean by that is that it features hero characters, presumably mainstays of the Xbox shooters, who are the main players in this game's story. These exceptionally thick-necked boys and girls deliver unbelievably sincere dialogue, and generally have more life to them than the randomly generated generic soldiers who will join your company throughout the game. You can customize the looks of the generic soldiers and the abilities of both types of units. However, because you will be required to use the hero characters much more frequently than the other types of soldiers, they will inevitably gain more levels, more abilities, and be generally more useful to you than your generic soldiers. Some efforts are made to prevent the gap becoming too great. For instance, there are sections of the game where you need to complete a series of side missions, and the game requires you to use each individual soldier in your roster only once per mission. This ensures that a wide variety of soldiers end up getting used, but it does little to prevent the hero characters pulling ahead in terms of abilities. As a result, when it comes time for you to hire new soldiers, you are incentivized to dismiss some of your previous generic soldiers to make way for new ones of a higher level. This makes them feel even more disposable in comparison to the hero units. As a result, the thin customization metagame failed to pull me in like in XCOM. If I'm not convinced of a soldier's long-term prospects in my main party's rotation of units, then I'm not going to put much time into customizing their looks. As you cannot customize the look of the hero characters, you are left likely only getting invested in maybe one or two of the customizable side characters. The rest are either forgotten about or eventually swapped out for higher level new recruits. So the aesthetic customization options never end up amounting to much. The same cannot be said for the game's ability skill trees, however. Fortunately, they contain a wide variety of builds that are fun to experiment with. The game gives you plenty of chances to reset your ability unlocks too, so when you eventually work out your preferred builds, you can swap your older characters to them. Each class has more potential builds than any of the classes did in XCOM. Unfortunately, they may have about the same amount or perhaps even fewer viable builds. Some skill trees do seem to be just straight up better than others. I don't think that's necessarily a problem though, and overall this part of the metagame can reasonably be called a success. It's just a shame that the ability trees and aesthetic customization is all there is to it. No base building, research, tech upgrades, or careful management of resources. If you're going to copy XCOM, you might as well be thorough about it. The lack of a robust metagame is important to your overall experience with the game, as it reduces the total number of incentives the game has at its disposal to keep you playing. Like it or not, in the modern era of game design, few games just get by on their combat alone. They almost all have some kind of progression system in them. Like any other aspect of a game, their progression systems should be subject to criticism, and this one is lackluster, at least in comparison to seemingly the most relevant other game, XCOM. Still, there are other methods a game can employ to pull you through it. One of the most straightforward, perhaps, is its narrative. Not having played any of the previous Gears games, I was ready to understand little of this one. However, its status as a prequel, combined with a clear intent from the writers to not confuse new players, ensured that I was never out of my depth. In fact, this may be a detriment to some returning players, as the story seems to re-reveal certain story revelations that were initially delivered to Gears fans several games ago. Anyway, I was never confused, but not being confused is a far cry from being entertained. Unfortunately, this story is a dull affair, filled with silly action movie cliches. It doesn't seem to be trying to be anything more than that. Still, that fact makes it no more entertaining. The whole thing feels oddly dated. I think the design and aesthetic sensibilities of the Gears franchise are really starting to show their age. The first game came out well over a decade ago, so this probably isn't much of a surprise. Still, the fact that every character seems to be a bodybuilder is bizarre. Maybe it was bizarre then too, and I just didn't notice. I was at a very different place in my life back then, and the games really didn't appeal to me. Now I find the ultra-violence, poor facial hair choices, and extreme sincerity of the whole thing to be rather amusing, but in the same way one is amused by pictures of big hair from the 80s. Gears Tactics seems to be trading in similar notions of cool to those found in the early Fast and Furious movies. This may or may not be your thing. For my part, I found it quaintly entertaining. It also seems to extend to the aforementioned aesthetic customization options for your troops. You can give them tats, do-rags, bandanas, those ventilator masks that goths wear, sick scars, and exclusively attitudinal hairstyles. You unlock more and more of these on-brand options as the campaign progresses. The game clearly randomly selects some combination of customization options for each new recruit you get throughout. This results in increasingly over-the-top looks for newbies by the end of the game. It was not an infrequent event for me to recruit someone who has goggles, a hat, a gas mask, and tattoos. I mean, it's a look, I guess. So far in this review, I've skirted around the edges of this game. I've talked about its metagame, its story, and its general aesthetic vibe. I think these presentational elements are all important to one's overall impression of a game. Still, that doesn't change the fact that they are not the core of what you are doing when you're playing Gears Tactics. That is combat. Moving guys, shooting guys, putting guys on Overwatch, using abilities, and chainsawing guys in half. It's all here. This area of the game is definitely where Gears shines. It's a very competent rendition of an XCOM style system, and it even makes a few smart changes to the formula that really work in the game's favour. For one thing, this game doesn't take place on a grid system. At first I thought this would lead to moments of frustrating imprecision, but the game has a smart solution for this. Your character's actions in a given turn are limited by your action points. By default, each soldier has 3 action points per turn. The game clearly communicates how many action points will be used up in a given move with pip icons. The amount of distance a character can cover with 1 point is determined by their movement speed stat. However, this is where it gets clever. The amount of distance per point is not fixed. It varies based on what you are trying to do. For example, say you want to move your unit to a piece of cover, and to do so you will need to use all 3 points. But the cover you want to get to is just slightly outside the range you'd normally be able to get to with 3 points. In this situation, the game will just let you move that little bit further. This avoids irritating situations where you wouldn't quite be able to make a move with the action points you have. Cover, pick-upable items, and finishing moves called executions all share this property, as well as a slight stickiness, drawing your cursor to them whenever it is near. This helps immensely with being precise when executing your turn, and allows the game to take place on no fixed grid. In turn, the action feels more dynamic and less like a board game. Another clever iteration of the formula is the way in which the game handles Overwatch. When activated, the player draws a vision cone from the soldier in a direction that they will watch over, ready to strike during the enemy's turn. While this is less powerful than the XCOM equivalent, which involves no vision cone and your soldier taking any shot it can make during your opponent's turn, it is useful in other ways. Chiefly, it allows you to see visually what areas of the map your soldier will be able to make shots at fairly easily, and what areas the game thinks that are obscured by cover from your soldier's perspective. This makes predicting the outcome of your Overwatch much easier, and prevents soldiers from attempting really difficult shots. It manages to do this while not making the ability feel any more overpowered than in XCOM, because, as previously mentioned, the player now has to select a direction, which does reduce its potential slightly, in exchange for more information about that selected direction. So again, this is another change that gives the combat its feeling of precision and predictability, as indeed does the TactCom, a toggleable overlay that tells the player what is affecting a shot's hit percentage, be that range or obstructions, as well as quick information about what status effects are on a given unit. Also deserving of a special mention is the aforementioned execution system. These are melee finishing moves that can be performed on enemies by your troops. Apart from featuring suitably gruesome animations, these kills grant all other members of your squad an extra action point for the turn. This can be chained a surprising number of times, especially when combined with some of the class's endgame abilities. The whole thing is great fun, very satisfying, and can result in some serious momentum swings. This feature is actually not something I've seen anywhere else, so to me it represents the biggest single change this game brings to the genre. It genuinely is a good change that fits the game's setting and did result in some really exciting moments. However, this game is still lacking as an overall package. Without a more robust metagame component or a more engaging plot, both would be ideal. This is a solid turn-based strategy, which is actually a lot more than I think a lot of players were expecting. However, there are some obvious points where it could be improved in terms of its plot and the metagame, and overall, the game cannot be called a meaningful advancement of the genre. For a first foray though, it's definitely a success. It's just the points where a sequel could improve are very obvious to me. Overall, I'm going to give this game a 3 out of 5. So I hope you enjoyed that slightly faster, slightly quicker review. I'm still trying to work out what kind of a format I'm going to be going with going forwards, but I certainly think that it would be good to keep the review under about 20 minutes in general. Next time I'm going to review probably The Last of Us 2, and I intend to take a look at The Last of Us 1 first and put out a video on that game, kind of explaining, based on what's in it, what I would hope to see in The Last of Us 2. Then The Last of Us 2 video can respond to that in a way. Okay, look forward to that stuff soon, whenever it's done.